Okay, so a pretty big piece of news broke over the weekend related to Trump, Tesla, Elon Musk, and Tesla stock. This news made Tesla go up as of the time of this recording by 8% or $25, which is a very, very large move for the kind of size that Tesla is as a company. And this piece of news actually has a lot of long-term implications, not just for Tesla, but the entire automotive sector. Members of President-elect Donald Trump's transition team have told advisors they plan to make a federal framework for fully self-driving vehicles one of the Transportation Department's priorities, easing U.S. rules for self-driving cars. Now, the reason why this is such a big deal is in the United States, self-driving cars, their regulation, how they can operate, where they can operate, right now is driven by state and local laws. That's why you have things like Waymo operating in places like California and places like Texas. Companies have to wait for the state legislature, their local government to give them a green light to be able to operate self-driving cars. And companies that are well positioned for this regulation change from a scale perspective and from a technology perspective are going to benefit tremendously. And in this video, I'm going to outline why this is such a huge deal for Tesla specifically. None of this is going to be investment or financial advice. I just want to talk through what I'm seeing in case you find this helpful. Now, the reason why this is such a big deal is Tesla specifically has a very unique set of factors going for it. The way they're solving for self-driving technology is very different than any other automaker. Manufacturers like Waymo, Zoox, and others use a host of different sensors like LiDAR, sonar, ultrasonics, and a bunch of other things that are very expensive that make it very difficult for them to make a car under $100,000 that can drive itself. On the other hand, Tesla has an approach that allows them to make cars in the millions of units per year that can also drive themselves. And the reason why is that they've chosen to tackle this problem with a lot less sensors that are a lot cheaper. Instead of going with the LiDAR and the sonar and the ultrasonics, something they've tried in the past, now they're just going with 8 cameras around the car and an inference computer in the car. That's a fancy way of saying it's a very smart computer. It's an AI computer. And they have an AI brain at the headquarters that basically figures out how to drive by taking footage from the cars in the fleet, which Tesla has about 7 million of them out there in the world. It grabs footage from the cars, they feed it through an AI brain. The AI brain watches a bunch of cars just driving, and it just learns how to drive. And then it sends that code down to the cars. And so if you're a Tesla owner today, you know that your car right now, especially if you're in the latest branch of FSD 12.5.6.3 or something, your car is able to drive itself in literally almost every scenario outside of very, very specific places like parking decks, for example. Even then, I've seen some Teslas be able to navigate through that. Now, I don't want this to be an ad for Tesla, but what's really remarkable here is that Tesla has figured out how to make a car drive itself in literally almost every situation, and more likely than not, in every situation very, very soon, with just 8 cameras and a computer on board. The parts of these is probably no more than $2,000 altogether, which is going to allow Tesla to make millions of units of these per year, especially as the decade goes along. And all of these are going to be allowed to operate in the United States basically anywhere because of this new federal regulation that's coming. Now, to do some math to figure out how big of a deal this is from, say, a stock perspective or a valuation perspective, we can just look at how many miles are driven in the United States per year total. Just people getting around, people delivering stuff, whatever. We can make some very safe assumptions to come up with some pretty stupid numbers, to be completely honest. And again, not financial or investment advice. I just want to walk through this with you because this piece of news is going to change the landscape of the United States transportation systems. Now, according to Perplexity, which I've cross-checked, Perplexity is basically a really fancy ChatGPT. I like them better. There's about 3.3 trillion miles in the United States that are driven per year. Most of these are going to be non-commercial, so basically you and I getting from point A to point B. And we're going to use this 3.3 trillion miles per year as our baseline to figure out how big of an impact this is going to be to a company like Tesla. So if you assume of those 3.3 trillion miles, about 10% are captured by Tesla at some point in the future, let's say by 2030 or so. This turns out to be about 330 billion miles. 330 billion miles might sound like a lot. 10% of the market might sound like a lot. But think about what I just went through. Tesla is going to be the only company that's going to be able to manufacture these at scale, self-driving cars in the millions of units per year. Nobody else can offer this. And 10% of miles driven per year is equivalent to about 10 million cars in the fleet in the United States, driving about 30,000 miles per year, or about 5 million cars driving about 66,000 miles per year. So it's not an insane number of cars. You just need a certain level of cars to operate autonomously to reach that level of market share, let's say. And of course, this is going to be super realistic because the average taxi driver today, the Uber driver, drives about 60,000 to 120,000 miles per year. Professional Uber drivers, professional taxi drivers are already doing the maximum of what we're using for this example, and sometimes they drive way more. Now, from Tesla's perspective, they've already manufactured 7 million Teslas globally, and about 25% of those are in the United States. Somewhere between 1.7 million to 2 million Teslas are in the United States today. And so if you think about Tesla's plans to come out with a cheaper vehicle here in the next 6 months to a year, with their plans to make their manufacturing go even higher in places like Texas, China, so on and so forth, putting in new manufacturing plants in places like Mexico and probably some other places that we haven't heard of yet, it's very easy to see how Tesla can reach 10 million cars in the United States by the year 2030, at least 10 million cars. And so keeping that 330 billion miles per year in mind and thinking about how easy it is going to be for Tesla, easy relatively speaking, way easier than anyone else, we can start to do some math to figure out how much money Tesla can actually make from this. And if you're enjoying this content so far and you want to see more from me, click that subscribe button. Thank you so much. We'll start by setting a price of how much Tesla will charge to offer a self-driving car, let's say, to the public. I'm going to use $1.25 just to be conservative and to also take into account how much cheaper it's going to be to operate a self-driving car than it is, say, Uber or a taxi. 60% of the dollars you pay for an Uber or a taxi goes to pay for the driver's time. When you yank that out, you can see that you can be a lot cheaper. And so $1.25 is kind of this crazy number because it's way cheaper than a comparable Uber. And Uber today is about $1.85 per mile. This is before tips. And this allows Tesla to make a ton of money on this because they've yanked the most expensive part of the ride. And so if you make a very reasonable assumption and you say, hey, Tesla's going to make about 20% profit on that $1.25 that they are charging the consumer. That's about 25 cents per mile that goes into Tesla's pockets every time they offer a self-driving car on their platform. Now it just becomes a very simple math exercise. We take the 10% of that total market of 3.3 trillion miles, which was the 330 billion miles that Tesla's going to be able to take. And that number, that net number per year that Tesla's going to make in profit just from autonomous cars is $82 billion in profit per year. And this is just in the United States, and that is just taking 10% of the total miles driven in the United States. If you use a conservative number of 30 price earnings multiple, for those that are not familiar with this is a fancy way of trying to come up with a valuation, figure out how much the company's worth by taking how much they make and multiplying it to figure out how much the company should be worth. And so at 30 price earnings, that gives us $2.5 trillion of valuation based on, again, those assumptions. Tesla's about $1 trillion today. So this means a 2.5x on just that business alone, on just the United States at 10% market share. Let's say Tesla's able to go to 20% of the market. That's a $5 trillion valuation. And the other thing to keep in mind too is as autonomous vehicles become cheaper and cheaper versus drivable vehicles, the total market expands dramatically. How many people choose not to go out because gas is too expensive, or they can't afford a car, or they can't really make a justification that says, well, if I pay this much to go there, then I'm not going to have as much time, as much fun, so I'm just going to stay home. And then think about all the other things that open up by having the ability to get from point A to point B without having to drive. How many more people are going to be willing to take trips where they don't have to be stressed out driving, right? That's why this is such a huge deal. Having a federal framework for self-driving vehicles, put Tesla aside, will enable so many companies to come in and disrupt transportation so that people can get from point A to point B much cheaper, much easier. Freaking self-driving cars are going to be everywhere. You just tap a button and it shows up, okay? It's going to be insane. It's going to be one of the biggest deflationary forces we'll experience in the coming 5 years. When cost of transportation goes down by a lot, moving around becomes way cheaper. People, products, or whatever. And so a lot more of that will happen. And think about what happens to the economy. Think about what happens to society when the friction of going from one point to another becomes way less, becomes way cheaper. Economies will transform. Communities that have been beaten down will transform because people can now afford to go to work. 50% of the country is paycheck to paycheck, and they're paycheck to paycheck, and they can't even afford to go to work. So what happens there? Once you make it cheaper for people to go to work, economies boom, right? So now you have a forcing function for beaten down places to adopt this technology even faster. And with federal regulations coming to fruition, then this will exist literally everywhere in the United States. This is such a huge deal. It's such a huge deal. And Tesla specifically is set to really, really, really benefit from this. Huge. As long as they can manufacture and as long as they can continue that trend of improving self-driving technology, which they clearly are on. And so if I'm a betting man, which I'm not, okay, but if I'm a betting man, I think that by 2030, Tesla is going to be worth a lot more than they are today. But again, not financial or investment advice. This is just something that I see in plain sight. And hopefully this is helpful. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Take it easy, everybody. Bye-bye.